In this video, we will create an exploded view of the engine assembly that we created earlier. So I will save this scene and then I will close the scene. And here in this recent documents box, you will find the engine scene. But if you don't have the engine scene here, you can click Open and go to Sterling Engine folder. And here you can find the engine scene. So I will double click the scene. And I will also move the camera to top front right and fit scene. There are several ways to create an exploded view, but we will use a tool that will help us to create that exploded view. So we come over here to More Catalogs, we click here and go to ICM Tools, and down here at the bottom we find Create Explosion. And before I drag and drop this tool to the scene, I will select the assembly first. But it's not necessary to select the assembly first, but I will do it anyway. Then I will grab the tool here and drag it and drop it here. Then we will have this dialog box. The reason why I selected the assembly first was that a configuration will be created, and that configuration will have the name Engine Exploded because the assembly has the name engine. So that's why I selected the assembly, so that the configuration will have that name Engine Exploded. So if I now drag this slider, we will see that all parts will move, and they will move from the explosion center. I will drag back to 0. So what is the explosion center? Well, if I click this button, Show Tribal on Center of Explosion, a part will be created. We see here in the scene browser, Center of Explosion, and the tribal will turn on and placed in the center of the explosion center. So when I drag the slider again, we will see where the explosion center is. So it is right there. But this is not the movement I want, not in this case, because I want a linear motion in certain directions. So I will come up here to change from by explosion center. I will change to by Z directional part, and that's the local Z direction of every part in the scene. So I select it, then I will turn off the tribal. So now when I drag the slider, all parts will move in their local Z direction. But I don't want the crankcase to move, so I have to fix the crankcase here in the scene so it will stand still. And to do that, we have to come up here to these buttons. This button is to show the selection list. If I click this button, we see that all parts will be selected, and that's why when I drag the slider, all parts will move. So all parts is now selected and added to the selection list. This button is to add parts to the selection list, and this button is to remove parts from the selection list, and this button is to set the selection list. So if you select a part, you click here, then you have set the selection list. So in this case, I will select the crankcase and I come over to the scene browser, expand the engine here, select the crankcase. So now when it is selected, I come here and click this button to remove it from the selection list. So now when I drag the slider, all parts except the crankcase will move. And they will move in their own Z direction. Because every part has an anchor, and every anchor has a Z axis, and that's the long axis we see here. That's a Z axis. So the crankcase has a Z axis, and for instance the displacer piston has its own anchor and Z axis. So every part has a Z axis and they will move along their own Z axis. But I don't want all parts to move at the same time, because I want to move one part at a time. And to do that, I will select the cylinder first. So I come over to the scene browser, select the cylinder in part level, and then I come over to this dialog box and click the Set button. So now it is under the cylinder that is set in the selection list. So when I drag the slider now, I will move the cylinder and I will drag it up to 100. So that's enough for the cylinder. Then I will move the washers here. So I will hold the control button and left click on the washer so it will be selected in part level. And because they are linked, all will move when I move this washer here. But first I have to click the set button, and this slider will go back to 0 when I click set. Then I will drag the slider and I will move all 4 washers and I will move it to this position. Then I will move the screws, so I will control left click this screw and then click set, and the slider go back to 0. Then I grab the slider and all 4 will move and I will place them here. So next will be to move the displacer piston. So I come over to the scene browser, select the displacer piston, then I will click the set button and the slider go back to 0, and I will drag the slider to move the displacer piston. I will move it to this position here. And next I will move the glass piston. I select it here in the scene browser and click the set button and move the glass piston. And 100 is not enough, so I will change here to 300 and hit enter. Then I will drag the slider back a little bit, like so. And then we will drag the glass cylinder, or move the glass cylinder. So I select the glass cylinder and click the set button and we move the cylinder to this position. Then we select the cover, click the set button and drag the slider, and 300 is not enough, so I will change here to 700 because we will move the screws and washers later. And we'll drag back a little bit to place it here. Then I will control left click a washer and click the set button, and we will move the washers to this position here. And then we'll control left click a screw and click the set button and move the screws out to this position here, like so. And then we have the piston rod bushing, so I will select it here in the scene browser, and we see here the anchor, the z-axis on the anchor is pointing in this direction. So if I click the set button here and drag the slider, it will go in this direction, and I will place it there. So now we have moved every part in the scene, and then I click OK. When I click OK now, a configuration will be created. If we come down here to this box down here, we see engine exploded. If I click this button, we see the default, and this is the default we had when we started to create the exploded view. Then we come back to this menu, we can select engine exploded, and now we have the exploded view. And then we will create explosion lines, and there is a tool in the catalog that will help us to do that, create explosion lines. But it is important that everything is selected or nothing is selected when we use create explosion lines. Now in my case we see that this bushing is selected, so if I drag this tool and drop it here, there will be a line created only for the bushing and not for the rest of the engine. So in this case I will deselect everything, then I will drag create explosion lines and drop it here, and I will check these 3 boxes: create lines if not exist, create dashed lines, and show lines in scene browser. So when I click OK, the lines will be created and we will see them here in the scene browser. So now we have created an exploded view and also explosion lines. So now we will prepare for the 2D drawing that we will create in the next video, and we will place this or place the camera in a position that it will look good on the 2D drawing, because we will use this view on the 2D drawing. I think I will place the camera here, and then I will save the camera angle. If I now change the camera later, I can go back to this position and I will save it as a exploded view and hit enter, like so. So now I will save the scene, and we will continue in the next video when we create a 2D drawing of this view.